In August of 2009, a prosecutor in Detroit opened a door in a police department storage facility. She was doing a routine inventory, making sure the department's evidence was properly cataloged. What she found was 11,341 rape kits. They were sitting on shelves in cardboard boxes. Some had been there since the 1980s. Many from the 1990s. They were labeled, sealed, cataloged. They had never been tested. Inside each one, biological evidence collected from a sexual assault victim who went to a hospital, who trusted the system, who submitted to a forensic exam that took up to 12 hours of her life. Because someone told her that what had been done to her mattered enough to preserve evidence for prosecution. Inside each one is Dina, 11,341 kits, each one representing a person, each one containing the genetic fingerprint of someone who had assaulted them, and every single one of them had been put in a box and shelved. For years, for decades, while the attackers, including, it would turn out, hundreds of serial rapists, walked free. This is the story of what happens when you finally open those boxes. Welcome back. Today we're going to Detroit, Michigan, and to the broader failure that Detroit exposed, a national crisis that had been building for years in police warehouses and evidence rooms across the country. But we're also going to Ohio, because when cities started testing their backlogs, the Dina that had been sitting in storage started talking, and what it said was extraordinary. One case from that era belongs to a man named Nathan Ford. He was a probation officer in Lake County, Indiana, someone whose job was to supervise criminals returning to society. By night, he was committing the crimes he was paid to oversee. When his NA was finally matched, it connected him to 18 separate rape cases. 18 women. One man. Years of silence, enabled by thousands of untested boxes. This is the story of the storage unit. And what happened when it spoke. Wayne County Prosecutor Kim Worthy had taken office in 2004 and inherited everything that came with running one of the busiest prosecutors' offices in the United States. In the summer of 2009, during a review of the Detroit Police Department's evidence facility, her office made a discovery that would reshape how the country thought about sexual assault. 11,341 rape kits, untested, stored on shelving units in a warehouse. The oldest of them dated back to the late 1970s and early 1980s. Hundreds from the 1990s, each representing a sexual assault victim who had gone to the hospital, who had undergone the lengthy forensic examination, whose biological evidence had been collected and packaged and labeled, and then put on a shelf. The question why doesn't have a single clean answer. Police departments across the country had developed an informal practice of not submitting rape kits to crime labs unless they felt there was a prosecutorial reason to do so. If there was a named suspect, if there was corroborating evidence, if investigators believed the case had a realistic path to conviction. Kits from assaults where the victim knew the attacker, or where the case was deemed complicated, often never moved. They were filed. They sat. Worthy told reporters she was determined to test every single kit. People on her staff told her that was impossible. Funding didn't exist. The crime lab lacked capacity. The cases were old. She did it anyway. A rapist rapes on average 7 to 11 times before they're caught, Worthy would later say. Of our set of 817 serial offenders, over 50 of them have 10 to 15 hits apiece. That sentence should sit with you for a moment. Testing the Detroit kits took years and required federal funding, private fundraising, and legal battles over statutes of limitations. The results arrived, case by case, year by year. By the time the work was complete in 2022, the numbers told the story in a language that couldn't be argued with. 11,341 kits tested, 3,162 dinner matches, 858 confirmed serial rapists identified, 264 convictions. And the dinner from those Detroit kits had connected to crimes in 41 states and Washington, D.C. These were not isolated men who had committed one assault in one city. These were people who had been moving through American communities for years, assaulting, relocating, assaulting again, confident that no one would connect the dots because no one was running their DINA. They were right. Until 2009. But Detroit wasn't alone. Cleveland's backlog investigation, run out of the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office, found nearly 5,000 untested kits, some from 1993 onward. Ohio's statewide testing initiative found more than 9,600 kits across the state. Memphis found 12,000. The pattern was nationwide. The scale was staggering. And when states and cities finally began running the DINA, what came back from those storage rooms wasn't just statistics. It was people. Nathan Ford had a job that required him to understand criminals. He was a probation officer in Lake County, Indiana, the part of Indiana that borders Chicago and is tightly woven into the economic and social fabric of the greater Cleveland area through the movement of workers and families across the Midwest. His job was to work with people returning from incarceration, monitor their compliance with court orders, and help, theoretically, keep communities safe. By day, the law. By night, something else entirely. Starting in the mid-1990s, Nathan Ford began committing a series of sexual assaults in the greater Cleveland and Northeast Ohio area. His method was methodical. He chose women who were alone, often strangers. He was physically dominant. He attacked and fled. He used methods designed to prevent identification. When victims went to the hospital and rape kits were collected, the evidence was submitted to the police and moved, as was standard practice, to storage. Untested, Ford's DINA went into box after box after box. And the boxes went onto shelves. He kept going. In 2006, the Cuyahoga County prosecutor charged Nathan Ford with the rapes of 8 women, cases where investigators had finally connected enough evidence without DINA to bring charges. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 113 years in prison. He went to prison. He was 42 years old. He had more than a century ahead of him behind bars. And Ohio hadn't even started testing its backlog yet. Shortly after taking office in 2011, Ohio Attorney General Mike DeWine did something that would change the lives of survivors across the state. He asked every law enforcement agency in Ohio to send its untested rape kits to the state crime lab. The results began coming back. Dozens of hits. Then hundreds. Names that had been in prison for years suddenly had new cases attached to them. People who had been unknown offenders, John Doe profiles in the DINA database, were finally matched to faces and names. And Nathan Ford's file exploded. The Cuyahoga County Sexual Assault Task Force, a team of prosecutors, police, state agents, and others, began building cases based on the DINA results. Ford was already serving 113 years. But as each kit was tested, each hit added a new chapter. A 1995 rape. Connected to Ford. A 1998 assault. Ford. 2 cases from 2000. Ford. A 2003 rape in Akron. Ford. By the time investigators finished running the kits, Nathan Ford's DINA had been matched to 18 separate cases. 18 women. Crimes spanning more than a decade. DINA that had been sitting in evidence storage, some of it for 18 years, while he served his time on the cases where they had enough to charge him without it. The FBI Law Enforcement Bulletin would later document the reach of what was found. NA has connected Ford, a former probation officer, to 18 rape kits in Northeast Ohio to date, and to several other sexual offenses for which there exists no rapes that span decades. He was eventually sentenced to a combined 138 years in prison. A probation officer, sentenced to die behind bars, whose DNA and 18 separate evidence kits had been waiting in storage to say exactly who he was. In Detroit, when the conviction announcements started coming in, and they came slowly, over years, some of the women whose kits had been in that warehouse were still alive to hear about them. Some had moved on, built lives, tried to put what had happened to them in a different part of their mind. Others had never been able to. Laquetta Travis stood in front of a room in 2019 and said what needed to be said. I personally dealt with this situation for 13 years for one case, 11 for another, because I had 2 separate kits in the backlog. She had been assaulted twice. 2 kits, 2 different years, both in a box in a warehouse, both untested for over a decade while her attacker or attackers remained unidentified. She thanked Prosecutor Worthy for the work that finally moved those kits. On behalf of 11,314 of us, she said, I would like to say thank you. 11,314. The number is almost impossible to hold. Each one a person who went to a hospital, who trusted the process, who gave 12 hours of a terrible night to a forensic examination, who said, with that act, that what happened to them mattered enough to document, and whose evidence was then placed in a box, on a shelf, in a storage facility. For years, Detroit changed something, not immediately, not completely, but something shifted. By 2015, the Obama administration had announced $41 million in federal grants for rape kit testing. Multiple states began passing laws mandating timelines for kit submission and testing. Ohio passed legislation requiring all rape kits, old and new, to be submitted for DNA testing. California, New York, Illinois, Michigan, Texas followed with their own reform laws. The organization End the Backlog, founded by the Joyful Heart Foundation, began tracking the problem nationwide, pressing every police department and prosecutor's office in the country to account for their untested kits. Investigators began to understand what Wayne County Prosecutor Kim Worthy had articulated early in the process. The backlog wasn't just a clerical failure. It was a public safety crisis. Every kit that sat untested was a potential match that wasn't being made to a serial offender who was still out there. The DNA from these sexual assault kits, Worthy said, can help solve murders. It can help solve robberies. She was right. As the kits were tested across the country, the DNA didn't just match to rapes. It matched to murders, to armed robberies, to kidnappings. The biological evidence that had been sitting in storage was a thread that connected crimes across years, across states, across jurisdictions that had never spoken to each other. Nathan Ford's DNA connected to crimes in Indiana, Ohio, and beyond, crimes in multiple counties, under multiple law enforcement agencies, none of whom had initially been talking to each other because they had no reason to. The box on the shelf was the reason they hadn't talked. The test was why they finally did. As of 2025, the Wayne County effort has produced 264 convictions directly traceable to the 11,341 kits found in that Detroit warehouse in 2009. There are still over 170 unknown DNA profiles in the system, people whose DNA matched multiple cases but whose identities remain unconfirmed. People still out there. The national backlog, once estimated at 400,000 untested kits, has been significantly reduced by testing initiatives, but the true count remains unknown because dozens of jurisdictions have never fully audited their evidence storage. 18 years. That's roughly how long a kit from 1991 sat in storage before being tested in 2009. 18 years as a child being born, going through school, graduating, entering adulthood, while the evidence from the night of their parents' assault sat in a cardboard box labeled with a case number that no one was actively working. The DINA didn't expire. The names inside those kits didn't change. The obligation to the people who submitted that evidence didn't diminish with time. It waited. If you or someone you know has submitted a rape kit and wants to know its status, most states now have tracking systems. The Joyful Heart Foundation's End the Backlog initiative at endthebacklog.org tracks reform progress state by state. Nathan Ford is serving his sentence in the Ohio Department of Corrections. Kim Worthy is still the Wayne County prosecutor. She has been re-elected repeatedly. The testing initiative she launched is considered the national model. The DINA doesn't forget. Subscribe if you're new here. New episodes every. Leave a comment. And to everyone whose kit was in one of those boxes, you were never forgotten by the people who finally opened them.